An alarming report out of Missouri. We talk a lot about profiling and everything, but this one really lays it out in black and white terms, if you will, just how acute this issue can be. Now, the state's attorney general says there is a huge racial disparity when it comes to police stops. Now, just look at the math here, and nobody can debate. We got a problem. Blacks are 75% more likely than whites to get pulled over. They're also much more likely to get searched, and they're found with contraband less often than the whites who are. You know, Mayor, I've talked about driving while black. We did a whole big thing out in New Jersey when that report first come out. There is a contention, and I'm not looking to relitigate this all. Listen, part of the problem, stop and frisk. We talked about this yesterday with the New York City. One of the higher ups said, stop and frisk, stop, and look at the murder rates and the shootings have gone up, certainly in parts of the city. But when we see data like this, it says it's systemic. It's not an accident, right?
Absolutely. And what nobody ever says, we talk about black on black crime, we don't talk about white on white crime, and the fact that 83% or maybe more, 88% of the of white victims are attacked by white people. If you look at it, the FBI statistics show that 69.3% of all people arrested in the United States are white. We're not engaging in these same tactics there.
What I think the public would be less shocked, if we're not going to be PC for a minute, is they're not shocked that blacks are pulled over more likely. They're probably not as shocked that blacks are searched more often than whites. What they were shocked is the odds of finding somebody with contraband are higher among the white motorists than they are among the black motorists. So my basic thing would say, well then, why are you pulling over people that are less likely to net a result and take all the time to do the searches and the pullovers if the white guy has got you a better chance to find something that he or she shouldn't have?
And it's the same analysis with stop and frisk, which happens in New York. So we're focusing on Missouri right now because it's a southern state and Ferguson has just recently happened. But the same thing happens right here in New York City. And when you stop and consider stop and frisk, almost 90% of the people pulled over were black or Hispanic. And only a very small percentage of them, less than 10%, ever resulted in actual arrest, and most of them were for minor things. What do you think it comes from that there's a mandate, if not explicitly said, encouraged, pull over these folks and do this, and don't pull over these folks and don't do that? You're dealing with centers of power. And so you can go to a poorer neighborhood, and if you go to a poor inner city neighborhood and you arrest people.
We're talking highways here. We're not talking about one town.
Well, we're picking, and again, in highways, if you're deciding you're going to pick people that you choose to pick. So a lot of times you're picking people who are not going to have the political power in your town, or they're coming from out of state, so they're not voting there anyway, so it doesn't make a difference. And it's a revenue generator. And it's the same thing with overtime in policing. You want to remove the profit component from law enforcement.
You weren't surprised maybe by it. I was by how big it was. 75% more likely. All right, Doug, this one for you. And this comes out of Libby, Montana. Asbestos mess that has been going on for decades. A mine owned by W.R. Grace polluted the town with asbestos. Not just a little bit. Hundreds of people died. Thousands left. And there's a new documentary out telling the tragic story.
My first experience there was, what in the hell did I get myself into? I just couldn't believe the dust, and I had this respirator on, and in about 15 minutes I couldn't breathe.
Now, W.R. Grace paid a $250 million civil settlement for the cleanup, but was acquitted of criminal charges of conspiring to hide the dangers. Doug, the point, I guess, for me is, for any of us who thought asbestos was an issue for our parents' generation, there's still the after effects going on right now, much more than we think?
Much more than you think. You got to remember that from your time from exposure to the time you get the cancer, mesothelioma or lung cancer, it's a minimum of 20 years, could be 30, 40, 50 years. So everybody, and that's the whole point with it. Asbestos has no onion quality, meaning it doesn't smell bad, doesn't make you itch. You would have no reason to know it's killing you unless somebody actually told you. And that goes to why these corporations are really kind of in a, they deserve responsibility for this, because they knew or should have known it was dangerous, and these people that were working with it or living around it, they would have no reason to know it unless they were warned by the people that did, and that's the corporations that were making money off of it.
Finally, Jimmy, I wanted to get your take on this one. Federal prosecutors, hey, everybody's got tough jobs here, and they've been in the headlines quite a bit lately here, but the question is, have they become overly aggressive? And this New York Times op-ed says the following. Federal laws passed at the height of our punitive frenzy back in the 80s have been abused by overzealous federal prosecutors to compel guilty pleas and obtain long, unjust prison sentences. You live this world here. What was the intent of laws put in place in the 80s that you're dealing with now for stuff that they never intended?
The statute is Section 851, and what it means is it was geared towards the most egregious offenders, the kingpins, the high-level traffickers. And what it does is it doubles the mandatory minimum. What it's being used for, and hopefully it'll stop being used for, is you have a lower-level offender who's, let's say, facing a 5 or a 10-year minimum. A plea offer is made. It's not a fair plea offer. You don't want to take it. It's unjust. But then you get the call from the prosecutor that says, listen, you got till Friday to take the plea or I'm filing the 851. Once that 851 gets filed, 5 becomes 10, 10 becomes 20. You go and visit the client. You look at each other, and he takes the plea because it becomes a risk that's beyond belief. And then those that don't take the plea because it's just unfathomable go to trial, and if they lose, they get punished even more. So you have thousands of people.
Get an example of a case that would blow the public's mind.
Yeah, sure. You have somebody who is a lower level part of a conspiracy, but a major conspiracy. You're a conspiracy, you're in for a penny, in for a pound, and the kid is charged with the conspiracy. He's facing a mandatory 10. He shouldn't be. He should maybe get a year, 2, 3 years. The government says either take this 7, 8, 9-year offer, or I'm going to file the 851. This kid, a low-level guy with no skin in the game, doesn't make any money from it. He's just there, and a lower-level guy, a minor participant, is now looking at 20 years. He winds up taking an 8 or 9-year plea. And it's wrong. It's there to punish those who arguably should be punished for 20 years, not to be used as a hammer
So
to
who
make
can
people
decide
plead.
how to limit the application of it?
Eric Holder issued a directive to federal prosecutors, 2 directives that are important. One is stop charging mandatory minimums for lower-level people, even if the quantity calls for it, and stop using 851 as a hammer to get people to plea. The first one, I'll leave it aside. But the second one is a concession that that's what they were doing. Because the Attorney General doesn't need to tell you to stop doing something unless he feels that you're doing it.
But it's still discretionary at this point. If a prosecutor wants to stick it to you, he's going to stick it to you.
Absolutely.
So I'm curious, the judges, do the judges know what's going on when this is going on in their courtroom or either behind the scenes or whatever else? And can they tell the prosecutor, what are you doing?
Oh, they can say, what are you doing? But they have absolutely no discretion. This isn't a guideline issue. This is a statutory issue. You file an 851 on a 10-year mandatory minimum. As unhappy as this judge is, he's giving you 20 years if you get convicted because he has to. It's statutory. He's got no power to avoid it.
Jim, sometimes these people are people who would have been charged, their conduct would have been perfectly fine as being charged as a misdemeanor in state court, where they would have gotten a conditional discharge, maybe even no criminal conviction at all.
That's right. That's right.
And they're looking at 10, even 20 years.
Absolutely.
5 becomes 10, 10 becomes 20. And there's nothing anybody can do about
And if the prosecutors really believe that's what you deserve, then that should be in the offer in the first place. You shouldn't be getting another offer.
So to change this, does this have to happen at the federal level? That they have to rewrite the guidelines of the judiciary?
No, it's not a guideline issue. The statute needs to be repealed. You can give it. Listen, judges have discretion, Rich. If it's 10 to life, if it's 5 to 40, if it's 0 to 20, goodness gracious, you're talking about football numbers. Judges have the discretion to send the bad guys away, and I'm telling you, they do. This notion that they don't is just wrong.
Gentlemen, thank you. And again, Supreme Court's going to be hearing some important cases for the balance of this session. We're probably going to get some decisions by the next time we get together next Wednesday. All right, till then, though, thank you, guys. When we come back, I got your Hudson Valley headlines. Stay with us.